In this video we're going to talk about force, and we'll start with definition of force. The definition of force is simply a push or a pull that causes movement. So for example, we've got someone here pushing a wall and you can see it move, or he's pulling the wall and it's moving. So anything that causes movement is usually considered a force or caused by a force. So for example, if we apply some force, we can make things accelerate. That means it's speeding up, so it's going to be changing its movement. We can make it decelerate, that means it's going to slow it down. So again, that's changing its movement. If we apply force, we can also make it change directions, right? That means it's going from maybe going straight, then bending at a corner. That means it's changes movement, so it's caused by force. Also, we can make it compress. Compress just means squish. So if we squish something, then that's also changes movement. So thereby, that's an example of what a force can do. And a force can also make something stop, right? So if a car rams against a wall, that force that the wall has applied to the car has made it come to a stop. So these are examples of what a force can do. But you need to know the definition of force, which is a push or pull that causes movement. And here we're going to talk about an example of a contact force. So that contact force is called friction. Because you'll see that in this case, friction, which is a force, acts by direct contact. So it's going to be in direct contact with a surface. So friction is basically when two surfaces rub against each other, and that's what we call friction. Now friction is a contact force because again there is direct contact, and you'll see an example of non-contact force in a minute. But what you need to know about friction is that friction always opposes the direction of movement. So opposes means it goes in the opposite direction. So in this case, if movement goes in that direction, you can see that friction goes in the opposite direction. So friction always opposes the direction of movement, and it'll always slow something down. So friction always slows something down. So in that case, the box, without friction, the box will just keep going forever in a straight direction, but friction will eventually make it come to a stop. Right? So friction is a contact force between two surfaces, in this case the box and the floor. It always opposes movement. So always opposes the direction of movement. If the direction moves that way, friction goes the other way, and it will always slow movement down. In the last example, we talked about a contact force, but now we're going to talk about a non-contact force. That's a force that acts without directly touching anything. And one example of this would be magnetism. Because if we have two magnets, we have two magnets right here. We have one magnet where the south pole touches or tries to touch the other south pole of the other magnet. But what happens here is like poles, that means both south and south are alike, so that's what we call like poles. What they will do is like poles repel. So what's going to happen, if we try to squeeze those two to come together, they're not going to be happy. They're actually going to go the opposite direction. So they're going to repel each other. They're not going to come close together. They're going to have a distance between the two. So here what we have is we have a force that separates those two. It doesn't allow them to come close together. It separates those two, even though we don't have any direct touching. That's what we call a non-contact force. As is here. So now we have one south and one north. These are what we call unlike poles because they're the opposite. But what happens here, unlike poles will always attract. So these two will actually come together. They'll meet, and they'll be attracted to each other. So they'll come together and meet, even though they're actually there's no direct force that brings them together. There is a force, but it's called a non-contact force, which means it's this magnetic field that we can't see, you can't feel. Right? That's bringing it together, but it's not an actual contact force, which friction was the last example. So for magnetism, you need to know it's a non-contact force, and you need to know that like poles will always repel. So for example, if you have south and south, we try to bring it together, it's not going to work. It's going to repel. As is north and north, those two will always repel each other as well. Whereas if you have unlike poles, so south and north, they'll actually be attracted to each other and they'll come and meet at some point.